All right, so our topic here today, as I mentioned, is going to be how and why to perform a Wi-Fi site survey. I am Jerry Ola, and I've got Andrew. You want to introduce yourself on here?
I'm just Andrew. All the detail you need is there.
And Andrew, you're going to be helping out like with Q&A and chat and stuff like that. Is that right?
Yeah, don't use the chat because sometimes it can become well. Use the chat to chat and banter, but if you have a question, put it in the Q&A, and then I can get to it and make sure it gets answered, and maybe have Jerry help us out if it's a long question.
Awesome. And yeah, I do see some chat going on already. Appreciate you guys using that. Yeah, feel free to have a little sidebar chats in there. I'll try to monitor that as much as I can. But yeah, as Andrew said, find that Q&A panel. Hopefully this content will stir up some thoughts and questions and stuff, and we'll definitely save some time at the end to try and get all those answered. So yeah, Andrew will try to answer those throughout, and then if you want to flag some of those, Andrew, for the end, we'll get to those. Cool. All right. So the first thing I want to kind of talk about when it comes to site surveys is different types of site surveys, and probably even more importantly of that of what is not a site survey. So often I hear things called surveys that tend to create more confusion than not. So usually when I think of site surveys, I think of these kind of three main types of surveys, either a pre-deployment site survey, a post-deployment site survey, then we have things like an AP on a stick survey. What I crossed off there is a predictive survey, which I do see commonly kind of thrown around, but what I found is the predictive survey creates a lot of confusion. And mostly what it ties to, it seems like, is the term survey means many different things, right? So what I've stuck with from a terminology standpoint is anytime I refer to something as a survey, that's referencing something boots on the ground. You're going on site, physically at the site, right? Doing a survey. A predictive survey doesn't meet that requirement, right? Generally, we're not on site or we don't need to be on site. So what I prefer to call it would be a predictive design. So if you've got that kind of terminology in your head of like predictive survey, I would encourage you to switch to using something like a predictive design, simulated models, those kind of things. I like more of those terminologies to make it very clear of what we're referencing here. So, if you're quoting work or something like that, we know what's expected. I've ran into issues of that of like somebody, paying for this like predictive survey, and then there's some confusion of like, oh, are you coming on site? And it's like, oh, well, I thought you just wanted me to do like a simulated design, and then they were expecting us to actually do like a walkthrough like site survey of it. So to make sure everything's clear, highly recommend that. But yeah, that's one of those, we'll probably get into several of these throughout there of these kind of controversial, heated type things that always go hand in hand, it seems like, with these kind of technologies and just different terminologies more than anything. But let's talk about the pre-deployment site survey. So I actually really like the pre-deployment site survey. And this is again making sure that we're clear on the terms. So when we're talking about pre-deployment site survey, we're not talking about a simulation. That's another thing that gets confused with pre-deployment site survey. When we're saying that, I'm saying going on site, actually walking the site, doing an RF survey, a Wi-Fi survey, either using the passive survey method or the active survey method. We'll talk about those terms in a little bit here as well. Ideally, or minimally, you want to do a passive survey. Active surveys, as I mentioned, they are kind of optional to provide you some additional insights to maybe the current status and performance of the network. But really what we're trying to do is kind of capture, okay, what's kind of the existing conditions? In addition to that, the big reason why I'm a big fan of pre-deployment site surveys is because of the enhancements that we have in tools like Hamina, where we can leverage that survey data in our designs to actually kind of influence and almost like what I like to say, calibrate the design, right? Because we can learn so much about the environment and how the RF is propagating through that environment from just doing a site survey. So by doing that on the front end of this pre-deployment side of things, we can one kind of learn the existing conditions, where the gaps are, where the potential issues are that we need to remediate, maybe in a refresh, but also we can learn a ton about the environment. So we'll get into that more in a little bit here, but I just want to kind of lay out these terms so we're all on the same page. So the post-deployment site survey, what do you think, Andrew? Between like a pre-deployment site survey and a post-deployment survey, which one which one would you bank on? Which one's kind of a must-have if you have to choose between one or the other?
Oh, I don't think there's a good answer. I've spent a lot of time doing post-deployment surveys, so I
Yeah,
would I would say that one. But the
I would agree.
predictive. Okay, all right, it wasn't a trap. Phew,
It
I
was
passed the
not a
test.
trap. I think, often we do have to kind of pick and choose, right? Budget reasons, whatever, time, budget, things like that. If I had, under perfect situations, I would like to be able to do both a pre and post deployment survey, give me the best of kind of both worlds or whatever, or kind of that pre and post view, and make sure that we did alleviate the original problems that were there. But often, the customer's not going to be maybe willing to pay for the pre-deployment survey, or they're like, hey, we need to get this thing implemented. We don't have time to do this pre-deployment survey. So we got to pick and choose one of them. The post-deployment survey, in my eyes, is the most critical because that's going to validate a lot of different things, right? First, the goal of the post-deployment survey is to validate, does the network design that we created meet our requirements? In addition to that, the post-deployment survey is going to also help us to understand, did all the equipment get installed correctly? Is it actually working correctly? Is there malfunctioning equipment, a malfunctioning antenna? Is it actually, put on the ceiling where we designed it, or did they put it on the wall? Those kinds of things, right? And then is it actually configured correctly? Did it get configured with the right transmit power? Did it get configured with the right channel configuration? Those kind of things can all be seen as part of that post-deployment site survey. Oops, bumped my mouse there. But yeah, obviously a big factor there is going to be if we have coverage gaps. Also, if we find things like rogue APs or interference from maybe outside sources of neighboring APs, personal hotspots, wireless printers, all sorts of other things that might be operating in that space that we need to be aware of, that because we didn't do a pre-deployment site survey, we may not, have been able to catch that on the pre-deployment side. Now we got to deal with that on the post-deployment side.
So,
Oh,
so
also it's
Jerry,
gonna, yeah, go ahead.
let me challenge you there as a counterpoint. And this is why I said I think you can argue for either. The predictive designs are getting so good now that actually a pre design survey would let you collect accurate wall measurements, and then the post isn't needed because the designs are so good and so accurate that you're just really validating almost a given. So what do you think of that kind of counterpoint to in favor of the pre-survey?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think it's a good point. I think that actually even probably ties more into this next survey, which is the AP on a stick. And I would argue that point even stronger on that piece of it. But yes, I think it ties to both the pre-deployment site survey as well as the AP on a stick, because the software, the simulation software, the modeling software has improved so much over the last, 5 to 10 years. Like we don't need to do all this kind of upfront work, right, to really necessarily learn the environment or see how the signal is going to propagate, because we can simulate it so much more accurately now without actually having to take these real world measurements. Now, in certain environments, like I indicated on the AP on a stick, so if you're not familiar with AP on a stick, that's where we actually take the planned AP, ideally the planned AP model or antenna that we're planning to deploy, and we're actually going to temporarily put that access point up, usually using some type of a tripod, ideally even on wheels or something like that, to make it very portable and easy to move around. Also, battery powering it so it really makes it portable. And we're just temporarily mounting it in these kind of planned locations to validate our simulation or kind of tune our simulation if it doesn't match up with the real world. Very detailed, very accurate way to do things, but also super time consuming, right? And to Andrew's point, because the software, the simulation software that we have, this modeling software that we have now, has improved so much over the last so many years, we don't need to rely as heavily on this, especially for something like a carpeted office space, where we can pretty accurately, with a very high level of confidence, simulate that environment, and do it very quickly, right, in that simulation. Let's talk about passive versus active surveys. This is another one of these terminology things that I often see getting kind of misused or misunderstood. So I just wanted to kind of lay the groundwork for that of the difference between these two, because these are two very common surveys that we see used in the Wi-Fi survey space. per, uh, Primarily we use passive surveys. Passive surveys are kind of the minimal. We have to do a passive survey to learn anything about the RF environment, right? That's what's going to build our heat maps for things like signal strength, noise, SNR, interference, channel utilization. All that data is captured as part of the passive survey process. That's what's going to show us things where we have like gaps in our coverage. It's also going to detect where like rogue APs are in the environment. We can use that in both the pre and post deployment survey process, and that will inform those. Also, we can use that data to inform that predictive design, like we talked about. The active survey side on the other side is quite a bit different. That's where we're trying to validate more from a network performance standpoint. We actually associate a client device to the network, and we perform different types of tests to measure things like throughput, latency, packet loss. How does the device roam? When does it roam? What does it roam to? That is all part of an active survey, active testing, active survey of the network. And ideal for things like if we have a really critical application like voice over Wi-Fi, maybe something that's really latency sensitive, and we need to ensure from that device's point of view that we meet these certain criteria. That's all part of that active survey process. So I just want to kind of set the stage there. Anything else to add from your side to that, Andrew?
Um, no, I mean it's great. I mean I don't put much stock in active surveys because I think the results depend on the day of the week, the way the wind's blowing, the direction you're standing.
Yep.
I only ever do passive surveys. But unfortunately, customers sometimes demand active surveys, demand those throughput tests, and you have to do them. But that's where I try and explain to them how the data you're showing is just such a snapshot that there's better ways to assess a network than active surveys.
Yes, I would agree. Yeah, I definitely feel like active surveys are optional and, there's a certain place for those. But generally, my experience with doing active surveys is they create more questions than they provide answers, if that makes sense. And to your point, yeah, you could do an active survey, you know, go through the site, do an active survey, and then 5 minutes later, repeat that same process and get drastically different results, right? So that's why I say it creates kind of generally more questions than answers versus a passive survey that's going to give you much more consistent results to some extent, and usually what we need to view from a validation standpoint.
Yeah, in fact, add on to that, something that I used to do a lot when I was surveying. And I guess this is more, am I trying to find the problem and fix them, or am I trying to produce some fancy numbers to give the customer to say, pay me, everything's okay? But I would get two devices that could stream audio and the other could receive it, that were peer to peer. So it wasn't streaming via YouTube, which is buffered, or Netflix or anything. It was, two devices on site, one transmitting audio over the Wi-Fi, the other receiving it. And I would just listen to audio the whole way around. And it had two benefits. A, I was getting to listen to music while I walked around thousands, tens of thousands of square feet. But B, when that music was interrupted, then I stopped and I spent more time and I surveyed in more detail and maybe I pulled out other tools. That
Yeah.
to me is more powerful than doing a throughput test in 10 places.
Absolutely. Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Yeah, and that's like specific use case, right? So yeah, if you need like a voice over Wi-Fi as a critical component of your validation, then yeah, you need to get a little more creative than just measuring the kind of layer one, layer two information. We need to probably go further up the stack, test things, like layer three and even up to like application layer to make sure everything is working properly from that client device. So how do we do these surveys? Well, Humina solution is this Humina Onsite plus Nomad kit here, where we've got a mobile application called Humina Onsite. You can install that on your iPhone or iPad. I've actually recently kind of switched from, I went from, taking back a ways, started with my laptop, started actually surveying with a MacBook Air was the first computer that I surveyed with, and then switched to an iPad. And then most recently, now I don't even travel with my iPad anymore, believe it or not, and just travel with an iPhone 15 and my MacBook, but I just survey with my iPhone, and then I analyze the results between my iPhone and primarily from my MacBook, and that kind of alleviated even the need of involving, a third device in there. Since I'm going to travel with my iPhone anyways, it was kind of like, well, do I really need three devices? Because I can do all the same things with my iPhone as I can do with my iPad. That actually now for me, it's just very seamless to go between my MacBook and my iPhone for doing those kind of surveys. But more that's more user or personal preference, I would say, than anything, as far as what that host device is that you're using for the data collection. The Nomad, on the other hand, is the Wi-Fi measurement device, and that's this guy here. If you can see my video, I've got one here, a really nice, thin, lightweight device. You can attach this multiple ways. I've actually got the shoulder strap for it on this one, but I'll show you in a little bit how that all works. We'll get this guy powered up and do some surveying here in my environment and see what we can find. But let's talk about, yeah, what we can do with that survey data of identifying the post deployment issues. Generally, we're going to be looking for things like coverage gaps, interference, performance issues, as well as rogue access points that could be interfering with our own APs. So the common post-deployment issues when we talk about coverage gaps are going to be areas where we see low or no signal. On the interference side, we're going to be looking for things like co-channel or adjacent channel interference. That could be from our own APs, or that could be from, again, like neighboring APs, right? Or rogue devices that are in that environment that are also trying to occupy those same channels and frequencies as us. So there might be some things we can do to optimize that, but the survey results are going to show these types of issues. Also from like the data rate side, we're going to look at things like, low throughput, any high latency or packet loss. Those kind of things could represent, from a client perspective, performance issues. And then the rogue AP part that, we need to know if there's some devices that are operating in that space that maybe shouldn't be there. Maybe they're just turned on by accident or by default, and we need to go in and disable those radios because they could be a security concern or just, from a performance standpoint, could be impacting performance. All right, so conducting the surveys themselves. So let's kind of go through this quickly. There's several ways that we can kind of conduct these surveys, and a couple of tips here that I wanted to show with you if you're new to doing site surveys. So as far as Humina goes, we have three different survey modes. We have continuous, we have line, and then we have point surveys. So what I'm going to show you here is, I'll get it pulled up on my phone here so I can share that my screen side of it with you. But yeah, between these three different modes, I've actually been in environments where I actually, in the same project, I use all three modes. Primarily for me, I do use continuous, probably like I would say about 90% of the time with my surveys. I'm using the continuous survey method. That's mostly due to the amount of data that I'm able to collect over, the same amount of time. You can collect many more measurements using the continuous survey compared to like the line or the point survey, which may or may not be ideal depending on what you're trying to capture and convey. Generally, more data, the better. But that does come with the trade-off of, accuracy and making sure that we're collecting that data accurately. Being that doing something like a continuous survey, if you're new to doing a survey, that might produce some errors. There's greater chance for error using a continuous survey, user error, I should say, versus a line survey or point survey are much harder to make a mistake with and mess up and kind of skew the results with. And I'll show you the reason for that here shortly. But the best practices, these are just kind of the general rules of thumb here. So ideally, we want to survey during typical usage hours. I know that's not always possible, but anytime we can survey, while users actually using the network, it's going to give us a better, more realistic data set of how the signals going through the environment with all, people actually working in the environment. Also, things like channel utilization, things like that are going to be more accurate for these types of things. But then also from the actual data collection side, making sure that we're keeping a consistent pace is really critical, especially when we're talking about things like continuous survey and even line survey, is we need to make sure we're not going like fast, slow, that when we start doing a survey and we start a path, that during that entire path, we're keeping that pace consistently. That's going to help give us good, accurate results. And then from there, it's just tapping on the map when you start walking, when you stop walking, or when you turn, anytime you change directions. If you kind of keep those rule of thumb those in mind, it's going to help you a lot, making sure you're providing good, accurate surveys. And then the last thing I wanted to note was, as far as the position of the measurement device does have an impact on the results. So if you think of it from the perspective of, okay, what is the most critical device that I'm validating for? You want to put that measurement device kind of at that position, right? So actually, I don't know if you can see on my video here, I've got the Nomad here in the position that I tend to survey the most with, which is actually at this kind of chest height. If you think of it from the perspective of like a mobile device, that's kind of at that similar kind of same height, right? So that gives you that perspective versus if you have it on your side or your back or something like that, it gives you a slightly different or potentially kind of skewed perspective depending on what you're trying to validate for. All right, so before we get into analyzing and optimizing the results, let's jump into the tool itself and just show you what this kind of process does look like. So we'll just spend a few minutes here. I'm just going to create a new project. I'm just going to call it test one so I can find it easily. And all I'm going to do is just drag and drop a floor plan in here of like an office space. And we're just going to put that in here. This is just a JPEG. It could be a PDF, CAD file, whatever. But let's just take kind of a typical office space. So the first thing it's going to do here in the Humida Network Planner is it's going to look at this more from a simulation perspective, and it's going to look at, okay, I know what walls and doors and stuff like that are. So this allows us to easily do the design, but we're going to kind of skip that for this webinar for the sake of time, as well as because this is focused on survey. So let's say maybe we're doing a pre-deployment site survey, right? So I don't need to model the environment because we're going to learn all that as part of the site survey. So now all I'm going to do is I'm going to jump over to my iPhone. I'm going to power up the Nomad. And the Nomad's super simple to operate, just a single button. You power it on, it boots up. And while that's booting up, I'm going to go ahead and share my iPhone screen so you guys can see what I'm seeing here. There we go. You can hopefully see that now. Is that coming through, Andrew?
Yep, lovely.
Awesome. Okay. So all I'm going to do is sync up my projects here. And you can see since I'm using the same account on Hamina Onsite as I am in the planner, all my projects just come across automatically. I don't have to tell it to like go to my phone or sync or anything like that. Hamina Network Planner lives in the cloud. Hamina Onsite talks to the cloud. So all those projects sync up with each other. And the nice part about it is now that project is actually synced locally to my iPhone. So my iPhone no longer has to rely on internet connectivity. If I go on site, maybe there's no Wi-Fi there or whatever, that's not a problem. I can still do a site survey, save all the data locally to my phone until I have an internet connection, and then it'll sync back to the cloud automatically. But here's our floor plan. I can rotate this around. I can figure out, where's my location. Let's say maybe we're going to start in this corner office over here. My Nomad is now connected, and I'm going to go ahead and just kind of configure a couple things here. I'm going to say we're going to be validating for coverage on the 5 gigahertz band, and we'll select a specific network. I'll select this network here. So that's what we're validating for. So what that allows me to do is on the bottom left corner, you can see it's looking at that Initech network that I've got in my environment here. I can see what the signal is. And even if I just get up and start walking around, I can actually see pretty quickly, when I'm walking maybe towards that NAP or further away. You can see right now, when you start to get into that kind of -30, -20s, that's a pretty good indication that you're, real hot signal in the sense of you're kind of standing right underneath an access point. So that's a nice little tip there. You can look at that in much greater detail if we go out of the project here. We have much larger views of all that same information and much more information, things like channel utilization, number of clients per channel, all this kind of stuff is going to show in here. Let's actually see if we look at like 2.4, we can see we've got a few APs in the environment here as well. Let's look at a specific network. And if we filter down to like our IoT network, we can see, yeah, there's no clients or anything going on there right now. If we go to the 6 gigahertz side, similarly, I can select that 6 gigahertz network and we can see the details about those APs as well. All the networks here are listed as well as the APs. And then what we can do is let's say I want to do that site survey now. So I'm going to go back. So that's just for like live troubleshooting. Let's go to this project here. Also, the scale was set for me automatically. I think I missed that too, but that's one of the other nice parts about Network Planner is it does automatically scale the floor plan. So that's why I always like to start with creating the project in Humming the Network Planner, let the AI tools kind of scale the map, draw the walls, all that kind of stuff for me, and then just pull it up on the mobile app here, and you're ready to go. So we talked about the different modes: point survey, line survey, continuous survey. So let's start with a continuous survey. So if we do a continuous survey, I'm going to start in the corner here, and all I'm going to do is physically tap on the screen of my device, and now it started that survey. Remember, the rule is you tap when you start walking, you tap when you stop walking, and you tap when you change directions. So for example, what that looks like is what would happen is if I walk across this room to this wall, obviously I'm just pretending here sitting at my desk, but this is what that process would look like. You don't have to rotate the map, but I do prefer to keep the map always like orientated in kind of that north heading. I don't know if that's the proper terminology to it, but basically the direction that I'm walking, right? So I always have the map kind of in that orientation, helps me to keep my bearings, especially if you're doing like warehouses with like long aisles and shelves and stuff. I always like to have the map orientated correctly. But notice what's happening here. As I'm collecting that information, we're starting to see a heat map. Also, as soon as I stopped surveying that room, it just processed a bunch of information for me about the APs that it picked up in that little survey that I did. And check this out. If I select one of those access points using our Explore view here, I can see the SSID information, the channel information, channel width. Oh, look at this. It's even a Wi-Fi 7 access point. It's transmitting at 17 dBm. So all that kind of detail gets captured automatically for me. Let's go back to our different survey modes real quickly here and just talk through real quickly like the different modes that you might want to consider. So like I said, the continuous survey, the risk of that is you always need to be kind of on your toes. You need to be kind of thinking ahead. And if it's a really hectic, busy environment, think like a really busy manufacturing or warehouse environment with forklifts flying around, it might be a little dangerous to try and do like a continuous survey because you're really having to kind of stay on top of things versus like a line survey. If I just tap here, now what I can do is I can just input my first location. Again, the same rules apply. You tap when you start walking, and we're going to tap again when any of those one things like we talked about before of we tap when we start, stop, and turn. So let's say we get to this aisle here or this section here, the walkway, and we want to change and turn down the hallway here. So all I'm going to do then is I'm going to tap here, but the difference here in a line survey is immediately it ends the survey. So it just created a survey segment. And what that does is give me a little breathing room, right? Because now I've got time to maybe rotate the map. I got time to kind of set up for this next position, kind of plan my next path that I'm going to walk. Just gives me a little more breathing room, right? Where I can spend as much time as I need to here now. I don't have to worry about inputting my next location over and over again. It's waiting for me to input when I'm ready to start walking again. So now I'm ready to start walking. I'm going to tap again to start that next survey segment. And then we're just going to walk down the hallway. Oh, but I get to the door here and the door is locked. So I got to stop there for a second, unlock the door. Now we get through the door and we just rinse and repeat that process, right? So very similar to the continuous survey with just that extra breathing room, if that makes sense. So anybody that's new to doing site surveys, I highly recommend using that line survey mode. It's really forgiving in that sense and just gives you that little extra, you don't have to panic, as much as you do with like a continuous survey, really being on top of your toes. But let's say we got to go to this mail room. And this mailroom is a really critical area, and we've got a lot of users complaining about the signal every time they go in the mailroom. And I want to make sure I get some really accurate measurements in this mailroom to really capture what's going on here. So I'm going to switch to the point survey because this is a really small little area. And I'm going to take a couple of measurements in here, but I want to really make sure all the measurements that I capture on all three bands are just captured inside the mailroom. So by switching to the point survey, it's again waiting for me to input my location. But what it's going to do now is when I input that location, you see this little progress indicator going around. That's it taking all those measurements at that single point location, right? So I just stand there while it takes all those measurements. I'm not walking. So this one has a little bit different kind of rule of thumb of you don't tap when you start walking. You're going to go to a specific position and you're going to stand in that location while it takes all the measurements it needs. And then once it finishes, it indicates that, and now I can go to the next location. And let's say we really want to do a good thorough job in here of all the little spots where maybe people work and sit in here just to make sure we got some really good accurate details. So that's really good, especially like in these smaller areas. The trade-off is it's very slow, as you can see, in comparison to the continuous survey or line survey. We're just taking a single measurement at that point in time, and you can see the duration that it takes to do that. So very precise, very accurate, but it's very time consuming. And it's going to take a long time, even just to do a room this size. You can see it's going to take me quite a bit longer amount of time, probably at least 2 to 3 times longer to survey this room using point survey measurements than it would be to do like a continuous or line survey. And I only got 4 measurements versus if I did a continuous survey or line survey, it's continuously scanning and taking measurements and then plotting those measurements along my survey path. So way more time, way less data, but it's very precise data. I know I talked a lot there, so I want to pause, jump back into the planner side. We're kind of right at that time already, so I promised to save some time at the end for Q&A, but it looks like I ran over chatting quite a bit here, so we'll stick around and answer some questions for you. What did we see in chat? What did we see in Q&A, Andrew? Anything?
So we only had one official question through the Q&A panel the whole time. And that was basically how can we use on-site to do kind of troubleshooting rather than surveying?
Right on. Yeah, so probably more related to like the real-time view.
Yeah.
Let me share my screen again real quick just to kind of articulate that a little bit more. So if we need to do some real-time troubleshooting, not so much of like the survey validation and analyzing the results, we can use this real-time view. One thing that we've also just added recently to this, so by default, this is just using the Nomad right now and just the radios in the Nomad. It's going to show me a lot of information about this environment. Let me actually go to the landscape mode here so you can see this a little bit easier. But this is going to show me a lot of information about the environment. Unfortunately, my environment here is pretty boring right now. I'm kind of in like a basement area and there's not a lot of APs that are audible. But if we were seeing like a really busy environment, we were at, was it Cisco Live last week? And they were using the full 5 GHz spectrum. This thing was lit up like a Christmas tree, right? With all the channels in use and all of them having very high utilization across the band. And that's just Wi-Fi, they're just utilizing the spectrum. What was interesting though was looking at things like 6 GHz, and even though all the 5 GHz spectrum was completely saturated and the Wi-Fi worked fine, it, but the 6 GHz band was completely untouched. Right, there was like almost zero radios in the 6 GHz band, so a lot of spectrum like available. So especially if you're doing like some event planning and you want to see what else is out there, that what spectrum is available, what can be used, what's already highly utilized, we can see all that in this kind of live view as I walk around. In addition to that, what we've just added recently is I'm going to plug in the Spectrum Analyzer module into the Nomad here, and we can actually see if there's any high interfere or any interferes in here that we need to account for. So what I'm going to do here is I'll start out on like the 2.4 side. So what this is doing now is this is a optional spectrum analyzer module. So if we do need to look for maybe outside interference of non-Wi-Fi sources of interference, this allows us to see that. So this is going to look at the raw RF energy in there, not like decoding Wi-Fi frames like the Wi-Fi modules are going to do in the Nomad. This is actually measuring the raw RF energy in the space. And this is using the Osseum Lucid. There's a little shoulder pad. In the shoulder pad here, there's a little pocket for that this fits into, so you can carry that with you as you're surveying. But this is, if we look at things like the 5 GHz band, we can see that as well. And then lastly, we can also switch to 6 GHz, so it's tri-band capable. But yeah, pretty quiet environment here. You can see there's not a lot of energy. We're seeing a little bit of something up on channel 136 there. But otherwise, yeah, pretty quiet environment overall. And you might even see a little bit. Yeah, I was thinking we might actually see a little bit more on 6 GHz because my laptop that I'm actually talking to you guys on, sharing my video and everything, is using that 6 GHz channel. So you can see there is a little bit of utilization on that channel that I'm using, but definitely plenty of airtime available. We're not saturating that channel with just my one laptop using that with this 40 megahertz or 80 megahertz wide channel. Actually, no, it's 160, sorry, 160 megahertz channel. We can zoom in and see that better. So you can see I'm using those 8 channels since I've got the whole 6 GHz spectrum to myself. able to use 160s and be just fine. Any other questions, Andrew?
No, there was just one other that I was able to answer easily. So
Right
that's
on.
all done and we're over. So we might let these people get back to their boring afternoon of meetings, I guess.
Right on. Well, if any questions do come up afterwards, I'll throw my email up on the screen. It's just jerry@humina.com. Feel free to reach out. I did have one other slide that I wanted to get back to. We kind of covered it already through some of the conversation, but just so that it's in the recording. As far as analyzing and optimizing the results, once we've captured that site survey data, there's several things that we can do with that. We can review, obviously, the coverage side, but some of the other things that we can do that's really unique to Humina is going to be things like using survey results to calibrate your designs in Humina Network Planner by using that simulated data to learn the environment. So that'll actually influence the simulation model to say, okay, use the survey data to learn the environment and show how that signal is going to propagate through that space. And that allows us to create things like remediation plans of, do we need to adjust configuration of the radios, or do we need to make more drastic changes like moving or adding equipment to the design, and we can leverage that survey data to help us and more accurately do that. And then the last thing to mention is this integration that we have now with these live or these cloud management platforms that we can do these live views. So after you've done all that work, you've done your design, you've done your survey, how do we kind of continue to maintain that? We can leverage things like live view to help you with real-time troubleshooting, real-time heat maps, going forward by tapping into all the information that we can get from the APs themselves once the actual network is stood up and deployed. So that works with really all the cloud management providers, your Cisco Meraki, Juniper Mist, Aruba Central, all those cloud management providers, Arista, Extreme. We can pull in all those over those APIs that exist in those platforms already. And we'll leave it at that. Well, thanks everybody for jumping on this lunch and learn. Hopefully this was valuable to you, but we'll have one more session next week, and we'll make sure to get these recordings out to everybody that is subscribed. Thanks, everybody. Have a good rest of the day.